Hello, everybody. I am Grace Klopp. I'm a double major in Chinese and IR.
Hi, I am Vince. I am an economics and data science double major.
And today in this podcast, I'll be introducing Vince to the class Chinese 428, which is the advanced seminar in Chinese language, culture, and literature. Viertaler titled this class, It's the Remix, Reinvention in Chinese Culture. And throughout the weeks of this semester, we've been studying Chinese literature, history, art from 200 BC to the present, from Analects to Mahua. And the prevailing theme is that Chinese history has been reinterpreted, rejected, and remixed dozens of times by Chinese people and by foreigners for a variety of intentions. This has happened to the point where much of the original content has become obscured. So this evolution of ideas often happen to advance new political theories or to appeal to the evolving audience or to have old stories deliver new messages. So really, not only did this capstone class teach us about important historical figures, but it also taught us about this process of interpretation. So throughout this podcast, I'll be talking about my capstone paper for this course. Within my paper, I wrote about several fundamental differences in governance and political philosophy between the US and China. And I attempted to explore these differences through Chinese literature, since literature is often the region's morals preserved on paper. So the first thing I talked about in my paper is this problematic application of modernization theory to China. Many Western authors of Chinese history have used this term in Chinese studies throughout textbooks to describe current-day China and China post-open door policy. Several of these authors have been John King Fairbanks, Merle Goldman, Jonathan Spence. And modernization is primarily a Westphalian concept and implies the existence of a capitalist economy, nation state, lots of industrialization, globalization. Implies a modern country in the dominant European sense. This includes a political system with democratic representation. So to apply modernization to China is to measure China's growth through this ill-fitting lens. It's a bit too broad of a stroke. And in my paper, I talked about a book written by a Chinese historian in the 1930s. His name was Jiang Tingfu. His book was called History of Modern China, and it was certainly a product of its time, as he frequently uses this term Jindai and the meaning to this is to make China become like a recent era. And to become like this recent era requires China to have this comparative variable, Europe, as China's more recent counterpart. And Jiang thought China was lagging in time, and to modernize would mean to become more like Europe. So the implied meaning of Jindai means that Jiang thought China was lagging in time. To modernize would mean to become more like Europe, and Jiang saw that the humiliating opium wars, even some aspects of Confucianism as further failures to reach this modernization. So this aspect of modernization is a bit unfair to China. China's progress as a region should be measured primarily by government stability, and whatever China values the region should hold as most important. What do you think, Vince?
Well, when we think about modernization, I think kind of along the same lines of westernization, like westernization of economic markets. I'm an econ major, that's why. We think about the West as maybe the only model of success, and they may not always hold true, because in a different time, the Chinese dynasties were great, even before the West. When I went to Beijing, like the youthful interpretation of modernization was wearing Western clothing, engaging in Western hobbies, even eating Western food. Like from an economic perspective, the liberalization of China is part and parcel of modernization. Now, I went to China for a study abroad program, and for my capstone project, Hannah, a good friend of mine, and I reimagined logos of prestigious foreign modern things like Rolex and McDonald's into calligraphy pieces to show a westernization of Chinese consumerism, but we had a more subtle point. We included the blunders that historically happened when these things were first forced together. For example, instead of writing the modern Chinese translation of McDonald's, we wrote the original Chineseification of McDonald's, which translated to eat wax crickets. Of course, the Chinese picked up on this, and the irony of eating wax crickets, written in fancy calligraphy, points to how mashing modernization into Chinese markets may produce disastrous results. So I agree. You can't paint a very fine picture with such a broad stroke.
That's a really interesting project. Did you gain your inspiration by seeing a lot of counterfeit items, which we all agree are very prevalent in China?
Yes, actually, when one of our trips outside of the campus, we went to Hongqiao, Red Bridge Pearl Market, and a good friend of mine, Emma, she bought a Kugi bag as opposed to a Gucci bag, like the G and the C were. Yeah, the Kugi, which we thought was hilarious. She had it for like maybe 60-70% off original price.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because in my paper, I also talked about the differences in thinking between US and China regarding IP theft, counterfeits, and just the understanding of ownership and authorship. So, I mean, still today, China remains the top IP infringer across all kinds of IP theft. And I think we can all agree that China's counterfeit industry is thriving. And in some Chinese stores, there's been a reported 60% of luxury goods as imitations. Historically speaking, China was built on the political philosophy which holds all property to be common. Private rights were, until recently, viewed as individualistic and destructive for the common good. So throughout history, copying and tracing works in China were viewed as a high form of praise rather than theft. Confucian scholars copied works to develop understanding of human behavior and educate themselves using works of past scholars. But after the death of Mao and his isolationist policies, China signed a few trade agreements with the US to protect American copyright patents and trademarks in China. China continued to try and emerge as a major international player by joining more of these international organizations in the 1980s. I think a few were the Patent Cooperation Treaty, World Intellectual Property Organization, and the result of this is today China's IP regime has been established as a result of these trade pressures from the West, and it looks essentially like the Western model, but only on face value.
See, that's interesting because I'm gonna talk about one of the points you brought up, which was thinking that patents are evil and all knowledge is for the common good. I'm from an economic perspective because I'm an econ major. I'm sorry, I keep talking about that because that's what I really like. But the whole point of a patent is to persuade people to invest in whatever they want to invent. So they are more willing to sink more money into research and development so that when this product does come out, you have exclusive rights to any and all profits to be made by your product. So what value add does counterfeiting provide to the market, to society?
Yeah, I see what you mean. And I mean, I could counter that by bringing into, in my essay, I talked about this phenomenon called suzhou fakes. And these are fine but forged paintings and calligraphy that were attributed to famous masters in China from multiple dynasties. And these suzhou fakes are basically improved in some ways, copied versions of originals. They often have a lot more color, are a lot more vivid than the originals. And they were known to be so good, and to the point where they were presented to emperors and other high-ranking officials throughout multiple dynasties. And I mean, this is kind of copying and tracing these works was, as I've mentioned, even viewed as respectful to the original authors. So in a sense, the idea of these suzhou fakes was to build off of the original, to work together to create a better product. And on top of that, these suzhou fakes had mass production on their side, so they were able to meet a high demand for these really nice paintings and calligraphy pieces. And to Westerners, Suzhou fakes may seem like a cheap counterfeit of original works, but in reality, they represent respect, tradition, innovation, while also fulfilling this market demand.
Wow, that's something I would have never thought about. And previous to you telling me about this, I have never even heard about this phenomenon. And maybe there is something to quote unquote collaborative patent sharing. And maybe I don't know if the West had more access to great Chinese art, perhaps provided by these Suzhou fakes. And maybe we had some way of understanding what they represent. Maybe U.S.-China relations may not be so bad after all. I mean, these days it's all tension, right?
Well, do you think there's going to be a war sometime soon between the U.S. and China? U.S. has a very formidable nuclear arsenal, but China's nuclear strategy is highly unusual and perhaps even more effective. It's quite intimidating.
What's this unusual nuclear strategy you're talking about?
Well, another point I have in my essay, I talk a lot about differences in military strategy between the U.S. and China, and for a portion of it, I focus on China's nuclear policy. So I of course link it to literature. I talk about the art of war, and I also talk about the famous Chinese essay called 36 Stratagems. So one stratagem is basically, it translates to create something from nothing. And in many ways, this encompasses the history of China's nuclear strategy. So China's nuclear arsenal has historically been very small compared to the US and Russia. And it's maintained at a low level of alert, married to a no first use doctrine. Mao Zedong called this the paper tiger strategy. China knows that the possibility of a full-blown nuclear war is very unlikely, extremely unlikely, because the costs on both sides are enormous. So China's nuclear arsenal is just threatening enough to make the US and other foes a bit worried. But in reality, China is focusing on deterrence and also maintaining the second strike capability, which means that if someone were to attack them, they would have the ability to, pick themselves up off their feet and attack back. So China is maintaining this lean and efficient nuclear arsenal, and it's a bit confusing to many countries. This profound difference in thinking about nukes can lead to catastrophic misunderstandings in the event of a military crisis between Beijing and Washington.
So it's a different unique take on mutually assured destruction, which I kind of like. But when it comes to war, I think something you alluded to, I don't think there's actually going to be a war between Beijing and Washington anytime soon, because, like you said, from an economics perspective, I think both countries understand that they stand to lose way too much. I think in the coming future, again, I don't have intimate knowledge of military inner workings or so forth and so on, but I think that liberalization policies and constructionist attempts to woo people, instead of scaring them, could be the next battleground. Maybe we're not going to talk about tanks and guns. We're going to talk about music and reality TV shows or something like that.
Yeah, and that could be very true, but don't be too quick to dismiss this possibility of a future military conflict, because another Chinese stratagem from the 36 Stratagem essay translates to wait at leisure while the enemy labors, encourage the enemy to expend their energy in futile requests while one conserves their strength, and then when the enemy is exhausted, attack with energy and purpose. And this kind of, relates to this shift recently in tone from China. Pretty much from the last few years, China's suddenly becoming more aggressive, vowing to develop a more assertive position on the world stage and surpass the U.S. in nuclear forces and other military forces by 2049. So I guess we'll just see what happens.
Yeah, that's interesting. It may not be as black or white as I thought, and I hope for the good of all of us that remains to not be that way.
As do I. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for chatting with me, Vince.
You're welcome. I had a great time chatting with you.
So did I. And happy holidays, everybody. Bye-bye.